Hello, and welcome to CyberDeck Users Weekly, a bi-weekly show about how to own technology. And this one's going to be a little different of an episode. I didn't do an essay. I did a collection of resources. Basically, some people brought up in the Patreon Discord, which is an open Discord. You can ask me for the invite. You don't have to be a Patreon subscriber, but the Patreon people know the invite link. That it would be helpful if I sort of built a list of guides and resources and, just helpful, kind of like a Wikipedia of stuff. Maybe not that ambitious, but just how do you do this? How do you do that? What do you recommend on these things? I want to make like a list of books I recommend, stuff like that, So I just sort of started writing out the first things that came to mind today. And so in the email newsletter, I'm going to be putting this stuff, and then eventually I'll have it on my website. So the three that I got out today are: one, buying Bitcoin. So how do you get into this crazy new fad of Bitcoin? And basically I recommend buying a very small amount weekly, and you can set that up automatically with like a Cash App or Swan Bitcoin. And kind of buying some amount that kind of feels negligible to you, and while you are sort of learning and trying to understand it. And I think that gives you a really good vibe for what Bitcoin is useful for, because it's very much about savings, especially right now. So, just like you would put a little bit of money away every week as a kid into your piggy bank or whatever to save up for a new bike or whatever, getting into that mindset with Bitcoin is good. And so I've, got some tips on how to proceed from there in the newsletter. Running Linux. And that's what this episode is going to be about. I want to explain the command line, but I recommend Pop! OS as the most user-friendly distro that I've found. Obviously, if you have an opinion on Linux distros, then you already are in some sense further advanced in Linux than me, so you don't really need my help on this. But if you're looking around and you're not really sure what to try, I recommend Pop. Especially because it has this Pop Shop and it's got this app store. Like imagine the Mac App Store, but everything in there is free and not necessarily open source. They're not really purists in that sense, but easily installed through this user interface, which is really cool. And then I also have a little bit about building a PC. A lot of people were asking me about this when I mentioned on the Vergecast that I had built my own PC. And so I recommend you check out PC Part Picker and find a build guide that matches your price range and your preference, whether it's AMD or Intel, and whether it's AMD or NVIDIA. And the nice thing is that they have ways of sort of helping verify that the parts that you're choosing are compatible. And they also allow you to say, like, I just want 16 gigabytes of RAM that's this fast, and they'll try to find like the best deal on it. I'm a little lazy, so I pretty much just found everything on Amazon once I knew my parts list. But you can get the cheapest price for each thing, Newegg or Walmart or whatever it happens to be. And then you put Pop! OS on that system. You could do a little bit to Windows, but it is actually a little hard. So I wish it was a lot easier so I could recommend it to everybody, but I know I struggled with it. So it's hard for me to say, there's guides online for how to do it, and it's totally possible. I'm just saying it's a little more difficult. I do find it easier if you install Pop! OS first. but it's also possible to install Pop! OS 2nd. And then I listed out some quick recommendations of things that I use. Like these are kind of tools that I'm proud of or happy with. I feel like I've found a slightly better alternative than maybe is standard, something that is a little more decentralized or a little more private or whatever, or a little less Google, Apple, Facebook, whatever. So I really like DuckDuckGo for searching. I hardly ever need to like use Google to really find something, you know. I know that in some sense the search results are worse, but it's what kind of one of those like 80-20 things or 97-3 things. It's really a 97% 3% situation where, you know, 97% of the time what you're searching for is just fine on DuckDuckGo. And if you're in a weird situation, you know, where you really are really looking for something very specific that's hard to find, maybe you use Google for that. But as a UI, you know, where you're just using the search as a launcher, it's totally fine. I like Bitwarden for password management because, I mean, it's fine as far as like compared to 1Password or all the other ones. It seems pretty simple. You know, it's got a browser extension, it's got a desktop app. It's great in all those senses, but it also has the opportunity or possibility of running your own Bitwarden server, which is not super easy from what I can tell right now because their product is sort of providing you this as a service. So they're not super incentivized to make it easy to run your own server, but it's possible. And I really like that optionality. I use Signal for messaging. I wish it was decentralized, distributed, all that kind of thing. But it is, I feel like it's the best we've got right now as far as easy to use, truly useful, and seemingly very well encrypted messaging and phone calls. And they're working on group video messaging. I really recommend refurbished small form factor enterprise PCs for like a home server. There's these really good deals. They're like $150, $200 depending on the specs. There's the HP ones and there's the Lenovo ones, but they're really small computers, and they have, because like a lot of people use the Raspberry Pis, and especially the Raspberry Pi 4 is so much better now than the Raspberry Pi 3 for this kind of thing. It is really, you know, a pretty cool option, and, you know, they start at like $35. So that's awesome. But, you know, Raspberry Pi, you need a case. You probably want to cool it. You need a power supply. Maybe that'll come in the kit. And then you need an external hard drive plugged in over USB, you know, and it's just like kind of becomes a little bit of a rat's nest, possibly. And here's a computer that is a lot more powerful. It's got like i3 or i5 in it. It's got, you know, 8 gigabytes of RAM maybe or more. And it's got an internal drive bay, so you can just slot in a standard 2.5-inch SSD that has as much capacity as you need. And it's still got USB if you want to expand beyond that. I just think it's an interesting alternative to the Raspberry Pi. Obviously, you know, it's not. I just think something people should be aware of. And it's basically, they're refurbished because they're basically of an age that the enterprise doesn't want this generation anymore. So there's just, they go out into the market, they get very lightly refurbished, if at all, and resold. And there's just a lot of them, it seems. I use Fastmail for email, and the cool people right now are using Tutanota, which is encrypted. Fastmail isn't really encrypted, but it was a little more convenient. I still want to look into Tutanota, but it felt really good to get an email address that is my primary email address that's not owned by Google anymore. So I felt like this isn't the perfect solution, but it was a big win over where I was. For web browsing, I'm using Firefox and Ad Blocker Ultimate. And Firefox seems to be the right blend for me of support for web features and performance. I mean, I'm using on a relatively beefy PC, at least compared to my laptop. So, you know, maybe I'm like on my Mac, I still use Safari, and try to, have as many blocking and privacy type things enabled as possible. Just because Safari just seems to work the best on the Mac. But yeah, I've been pretty happy with Firefox, and I have Chromium on my PC. I use that every once in a while just to check something, and for some development work. But I don't think I have Chrome on my PC. I think I've been able to. That might be a lie. Anyways, what I actually wanted to talk about today on the podcast was this command line. So running Linux, I go into, in the newsletter, I go into some of the basic commands you need to know to do something on the command line. And I think, well, I guess maybe I'm just projecting. The command line was very scary for me. And when I've asked other people, are they scared of the command line? A lot of times they're like, what's the command line? So maybe this isn't a big monster or source of terror and cold sweats for a lot of people. But for me, I found the command line intimidating, and I guess I found it intimidating, or I was considering it at all because there was a lot of stuff that I wanted to do, and the instructions always seemed to, open your command line. Now run this script that you don't know what it means. Now run these series of commands that you don't know what they mean. And what would also often happen is if I did one of the commands wrong, or if the instructions were a little ambiguous, or like they skipped an obvious step, I would have no idea what I was doing, and I would completely fail and I'd be lost. And one way I think of the command line, so if you're not aware or familiar, on the Mac, on Linux, even on Windows, there's a terminal program or a prompt or a command line or whatever it's called, that basically it's not like it's any more computery than double clicking an icon and dragging a slider with your mouse or whatever, but it's older. It's the ancient ways. And for people like me who grew up with Macs, it's not very familiar, and also it's like, well, what's even the point? But for a lot of developers, they've really never given up on these ancient ways. And there's something that's really, one, it's really easy to develop software for the command line. And so what you end up with is a lot of tools and very bespoke and weird and interesting utilities and very important applications and services that are all command line native. They might even, if they're so popular and so important, they might get a graphical interface to interact with them, but their native language is really is command line stuff, because they're based on these sort of very basic building blocks of computers. And so it's kind of one of those things where the future is here, but it's not evenly distributed. There's a lot of future that exists on the command line, but it's not evenly distributed. And I could imagine in a perfect world, we would have some sort of graphical user interface that would make that you could do the sorts of things that you do in a command line that could somehow be just as expressive, without being as difficult to learn and as intimidating. But that's a GUI problem, and that's really not the fault or responsibility of the people who are making software for the command line, because they found something that already works for them, and they're making a lot of software that works in here. And so to have access to this world, you either, follow very carefully instructions you find online, or you actually kind of need to learn it. As it's kind of like learning a language a little bit. And so one way to think about, so you open up, so let's say you're on a Mac, you open up Terminal. I think it's also called Terminal on Linux. I forget. I'm using like a different terminal called Kitty. It's called Command Prompt or PowerShell or whatever it is on Windows. So you've got a blinking cursor and maybe a little indication to the left of the blinking cursor of like what drive you're on or what folder you're in. So maybe something like that. But in a sense, you're kind of blind. And on the command line, you have to speak, you have to ask everything. Nothing's sort of presented to you by default. You don't get a list of programs you can run, you know. You don't have a whole bunch of buttons or options or a wizard. You have to ask for everything. So thinking of like a blind person feeling their way around or asking people for, hey, what's over here? You know, so the first thing that I like to do, I typically type in ls. But if I don't even know where I am, I type pwd. So that prints the working directory. So that's, you know, it just like in your file browser, you know, you've got folders and files in there. And you double click them to open a folder. You go deeper into them, or maybe you have that column view where you can see them side by side. You know, it's the same. You're on the same hard drive you were in the graphical interface. You're just interfacing it with it through text, and you have these commands that you can run. These are all just tiny little programs. They're on your computer. They're probably in like /user/local/bin or something like that. You have these commands and you speak them to the computer and the computer spits out an output, you know. It's such an easy, you know, it's such an easy model. That's why so much software is developed this way, because it's so easy to do. So pwd prints the working directory. ls lists the files in the directory that you're in. cd changes directory. Now, if you have ls and cd, you pretty much can get anywhere, because ls shows you what there is to get to, and cd goes into that folder, that next folder that you found by listing it out with ls. And then if you go too deep, you do cd space ... and that goes back a folder. And now you're very powerful. Now you can do a lot. And obviously, an audio podcast is the worst way to actually teach you all of this. But I just want you to sort of just get this vibe of why the command line is powerful, and why it might be scary, because you might feel lost in there, but you can learn the muscles that make you feel really comfortable in there and very powerful. So one of the best reasons to be using the command line is a lot of open source software that recommends that you install it via the command line. Like if you're on GitHub, that URL of where you're at when you are on the landing page of a GitHub project, that URL can be used to copy that project to your computer. And on GitHub, there's that green download button. So you can download a zip file, right? But that's way less cool. And you can't really contribute to the software. You can't really keep up to date with the new changes and stuff. But if you actually use Git, which is a version control system, you've got a lot more power and a lot more capabilities. This is one of those things. Futures here is not evenly distributed. Like, how many, think of all the files in your life that they're like final v2, or like have a bunch of revisions and you've got a bunch of copies and stuff like that. Software developers solve this for themselves. It's called version control, and it's very difficult to learn, and it's messy and complicated and weird sometimes, but you can have the source of truth, and then you can branch off the source of truth, make changes. Then if you like those changes, you can merge them back. And it's really interesting. So that's Git. GitHub is just like a place to do Git. There's other alternatives to GitHub. But so if you're on a GitHub project, you copy that URL, then you go to your command line. And if you're on a computer that already has Git installed, you type Git is the command, space clone. Clone is an option to the Git command, and then space, and then paste that URL. And so that will download that project. And then you just CD into that project folder that you just downloaded. And now you can follow whatever instructions they have for installing and running. So in the newsletter, I put instructions how to download Druid, which is a 2D graphics desktop app framework that I've been contributing to. And to run Druid, you need Rust because it's written in Rust. So there's just another command that you can copy and paste, but I try to explain it, what's going on. And once you have Rust installed, then you can do cargo, which is like the Rust command line utility, cargo run, and then dash example. Example is a flag. And then like calc, which is the calculator example in the Druid project. So basically there's a lot of times when you're doing something in the command line and you're told to do something like npm install, git clone, cargo run. Those are all, they're little programs on your computer, just like ls and pwd and cd. And your computer might not have them. So if you see one or you type it in and you run it and nothing happens, or it tells you, that doesn't exist, you have to go install that. So a lot of times it can be a little frustrating because these are kind of recursive processes. A fancy, nice GUI app, if they want you to do something, they bring all the tools along with you. But the idea in the command line is it's your computer. You're curating the tools, and you're using what you prefer to use. And so you're going to have to do a lot of little installing things. But like NPM is a big one. There's a ton of JavaScript. JavaScript is the most popular programming language in the world. It's what runs in the web browser. But then also people discovered that they could make web servers out of it. And so now it's everything, it seems like sometimes. So to get NPM, you need Node. Node is the computer side, like the server side JavaScript runner. So you can follow instructions to install Node. In my thing, in the newsletter, I've got instructions for how to actually install NVM, which I find a little easier than installing Node on Linux. You can, but like on Windows and Mac, you can get like a GUI installer and double click. And it's fun, like you're double clicking a typical install wizard like you would install Photoshop. But once it's done installing, there's no like program you go double click. Install a program that runs in the command line, and that's Node and NPM, which is the package manager for Node. So I have another, example in the newsletter where you git clone. I did this video on YouTube where I made a website in 10 minutes. Well, that's on GitHub. You can git clone it, right? So you copy it to your computer using Git, and then you npm install. So you run Node's package manager to install the packages that my project relies on. And then you can run this thing called npm run dev, which is like a little script that starts up a local web server. So now you have a local server and you can see the website I made, and then if you edit the source files of that website, it just changes on the fly. So I doubt anything I just said would motivate you to want to use the command line if you didn't already have some motivation. But the next time you find something cool on the internet and it links to a GitHub page, and it's like, oh, wow, here's an open source tool. It says I can use it, but all the instructions are like these monospaced, weird things. This moment, this is why I want you to hit me up on Twitter, and I want to help you get that running on your system. Now, I might not be able to help you every time because there's some things that are very hard to get up and running. But for a lot of the basic ones, like I struggle with Python, but I've managed to run a few Python projects. But a lot of them are JavaScript. The best ones are Rust. And you can totally get them running and get them usable and get them useful to you. So, like, oh, here's like a machine learning thing that solves something that we're doing at my job, but I don't know how to run it, It takes in CSV, it outputs some stat, I don't know. hit me up. I want to get you up and running on those. But I think as you do a few of them, as you get comfortable and feel safe and not blind in the command line, you can really expand your abilities and in a sense own more of the future. Because like I said, the future's here. Just a lot of it's on the command line and a lot of it's hidden. A lot of developers are making software for their own sake and they're comfortable on the command line. So they don't bother to make a GUI app. One of the reasons I'm working on Druid to make 2D applications is so that it makes it very straightforward, makes an obvious and straightforward way for a Rust developer to make a graphical application. So maybe there'll be more in the future, who knows? But right now there's a lot of great stuff that is only accessed or best accessed through the command line. So anyways, I think you get the point. I think you see what I'm saying. Hit me up if you need help getting something up and running. And let's we'll go from there. So short episode. Obviously the newsletter's got a lot more information in it today than the pod. But that's pretty much all I wanted to say. I just want you to kick those tires and expand your vocab and your skill set. And I got to line up an interview. I've just been so busy, but I got to line up an interview for next week. So hopefully that works out. But really enjoying the podcast and really appreciative of everybody who's listening and reaching out and communicating and talking about ideas. And I think there's a lot. I think there's something here. So anyways, thank you. Have a great weekend. Paul.